Dark Souls 3, Lords and Kingdoms. What we'll be discussing is what takes place before the events of Dark Souls 3. The events that are talked about, the Lords as they grow in power. One of the things that is emphasized in Dark Souls 2 is that kingdoms rise and fall without ever knowing about the events of the fire, about the influence of the fire. There's myth, there's legend, there's all these things, but there are kingdoms that exist and people don't even see mankind manifest itself in any undead sense. And we learn that in Dark Souls 2, because it was greatly concerning to the king when men became undead. And so when we get to Dark Souls 3, we realize that these kingdoms existed in their own power and might. And so the lords that we encounter, the Lords of Cinder that we see on the throne, that we collect throughout the game, had their time where the fire fading was not an issue. And so their kingdoms exist, and they are individuals of great power who eventually expend themselves on the altar. And so what we're going to look at, we're going to look at what we know about their kingdoms in what I believe is the proper historical order. There's one that could move around, but we know at least 3 definitely. And so, Dark Souls 3, the Lords and their kingdoms. The oldest kingdom mentioned in Dark Souls 3 that's of any consequence, as far as regards to the Lords of Cinder, is Ludlith of Courland. Until we burn Ludlith's soul on the fire again, we don't know much about him. We know that Courland was known for forbidden sorceries, and we know that he views himself as being small but mighty. We hear him dream and sleep. We even hear an interesting line where he says, "I don't deserve this." And it's given with the inflection of fear and rage and frustration. And none of this makes sense until we see the skull ring found on Ludlith's body. Courland was a great kingdom, similar to Oolacile. When a kingdom of mankind practices great sorceries, that is the key manifestation of mankind's ingenuity. Oolacile ended up falling to its own greed. And we see in Courland a similar drive to understand sorceries. And when we get the soul of Ludlith, and we see the skull ring, and we see the very nature of him, we learn who Ludlith was and why he may not have wanted truly to spend his soul. On the description of the soul ring, we read, "The soul feeder was a beast that insatiably absorbed souls to feed its own power. Even after its accursed corpse was burned, it is said that the pungent stench of souls left the air permanently stained." This is one of the only items that we get. This is where we look at our lore principles and we go to the simplest explanation. When an item is found on something, if there's no other allusion to where it belongs, we assume it belongs to the one it's on. And so Ludlith we can logically come to the assumption, would be called the Soul Feeder. We see that it's called accursed, and where not all of the lords voluntarily gave their souls in the fire, we find that even though Ludleth calls himself a colossus in a small body, there's the implication that his great power made him a sort of monster to the people of Courland, who already practiced forbidden sorceries. And so Soul Feeder Ludleth was burned on the fire. We don't know much more about his people or his kingdom. Later, we have another lord, the Abyss Watchers. We will explore more about them and their nature because they reveal a lot about the Souls universe to us. But what we know plainly from the start is the Abyss Watchers are unique in that they seem to so share a purpose and a goal and a drive that their soul seems joined, and they are treated as one being and one soul. We later find out that their drive to destroy the Abyss puts them in a strange position. We can understand that if somebody wants to destroy the Abyss, they are on the side of the gods. And so we can assume, since their goal is to destroy the Abyss like their forebear, their civilization was one that worshipped the gods. They went from city to city, and it was bad to see them arrive in your town. The first Abyss Watcher you saw told of the pain and destruction that would be happening within your city because they only went where the Abyss was found. And so eventually, since souls of power absorb other souls and gain strength, their allegiance to the gods and the goals of the gods and the destruction of the Abyss led them to burn their soul on the fire together. And so they were expended, and yet again another age of fire began. 2 ages of fire down in recent history. There's once a capital. Ancient, huge, wealthy. This capital is nameless, later only referred to as the Profaned Capital. But in its initial development was anything but. It was a powerful people. We don't know much more about them, except about their wealth and power. Riches strewn about the ruins of what later would be called the Profaned Capital. But what made the Profaned Capital profaned? On a fateful day, a group of oracles arrived. The oracles practiced ancient beliefs. They brought with them something called the Profaned Flame. The connection and the allusion to the Flame of Chaos seems a bit much to ignore, but the point is not the source of the flame. The point is what it did. And as these oracles arrived, they were referred to as beautiful women. Eventually, they manifest themselves and were changed by the very power they wielded into monstrosities, changed by their own sin. And so, as this city, this capital, this great central location in this world began to change and be corrupted, we know one thing about the civilization. They liked themselves, but not others. We learned that they had a distaste for the race of giants, and yet they had to reach out to a giant of great power, Yorm. And so Yorm seems to be a character of very high caliber. He seems to have those he wants to protect. We see at some point in his life he suffered a loss so great that it was devastating to him. So we know he has an emotional depth so devastating that he no longer even cared about his own life and entered a berserker rage that changed the entire way he did battle. And so Yorm was reached out to for help. This capital city placed itself under King Yorm, made him their ruler. The profane flame was handled and dealt with by Yorm, and it's said that it was handled when he burned his soul on the fire, his great soul. The flame was controlled. The uncontrollable was controlled for a time. The next city in the timeline is the great city of Irithyll, built in the very shadow of the city of the gods, Anor Londo, built on top of the ruins of the previous city, the profaned capital. Irithyll is so close in timeline to Dark Souls 3 and the player character's resurrection that there's a lot we know about it. By the time we get to it, it's empty and changed. But we know it's religious affiliation and dedication. We know it was a vast city, deep in culture. We know that during this time period, there was the establishment of the Church of the Deep. The Deep is one of the most interesting aspects of Dark Souls 3. We learn from the next Lord mentioned, Aldrich. We learn a lot about the Deep that we didn't know before. Where previously a church seems to have been established in the worship of the Deep, we learn why. Aldrich has a truly unique ability. He can sense, see, and commune with consciousness in a unique way. He dreams of real things. And so Aldrich himself sees the Deep. We learn through Aldrich and the flavor text around him that the Deep is conscious and real. It is alive. And the description of the Deep, whether or not it is true, it ought to remind us of Ash Lake. It's a place calm and still, full of life, capable of creating life, and yet with a consciousness. But Aldrich sees something different. Aldrich doesn't just see what is. Aldrich sees what will be. And when Aldrich looks at the Deep, this conscious, life-creating entity, he sees something that brings him to a conclusion that nobody else in the Souls universe comes to. He sees what the influence of the Deep can do. He sees that it can turn men into beasts. He sees into the future, and he sees that the deep itself changes the very nature of everything. And where previously the deep created life, now the deep creates a horrifying, consuming, cannibalistic consciousness. We don't see it until the DLC, but we see the Merkmen, who are essentially the replacement for mankind in its common form, but a deep version, one that is self-consuming, destroying everything, all life. Aldrich looks into the deep and sees that the influence can create things, change men into beasts, things that are unnatural. And so, Aldrich and the Church of the Deep, that he is responsible, in part, for founding and developing into what it becomes, a loose religion, now takes over this positive, happy church that celebrated life and begins to corrupt them. The deep, when Aldrich looks into it, he knows the source of this corruption. The heaviest part of mankind, the dregs of the deep, or the dregs of mankind, the heaviest part of the Dark Soul, leaks into the deep. The image is visual, it's supposed to be felt. That the heaviest pieces of men absorb down into this place called the deep and poison it. And so, the deep becomes almost a Lovecraftian, cosmically horrific flavor of the abyss. It takes the thing that is the abyss, gives it consciousness, and makes it terrifying. And so, because he knows it is inevitable, because he sees into the future, Aldrich begins his work. As the player character, when we arrive in the Church of the Deep and see the work that's been done there, we see sludge pools. One of the things that's missed by most people is these sludge pools are the remnants of bodies in the Church of the Deep. The Church of the Deep's goal is to further empower the deep by giving it more dregs. And so these giants in the Cathedral of the Deep, chained there, standing on the remains of bodies, are supposed to pulp them, stomp on them, make them a soup, and as the dregs seep down further and further down, they further empower the deep and make it stronger. Aldrich changed the very nature of the Church of the Deep and made it something horrific, something it was not meant to be. And when we look at Irithyll, the last fallen kingdom, the last devastated kingdom of the Dark Souls timeline, we see the rise of Lothric, and we see the influence of Aldrich's Church of the Deep. And that influence ends up reaching into the next kingdom, which is proud and mighty, and so contrary to this, as they worship the gods naturally, and the deep is the enemy of the gods, the greatest enemy the gods have ever known. We see it reach into the mighty kingdom of Lothric. And this gets us one step closer to where we rise from the dead in Dark Souls 3.